Well, good morning, and welcome to the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation's event, A Vision for International Antitrust at the WTO. I'm Stephen Ezel, the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy here at ITIF, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Well, antitrust policy is certainly a hot topic in capitals around the world today, from House and Senate hearings on legislation on antitrust policy reform and scrutiny of big tech and pharmaceutical industries alike here in the United States, to similar activity and scrutiny in Brussels and Asian capitals. However, it's vitally important that regulators get antitrust and competition policy right, because it affects the capacity of innovation-based industries such as biopharmaceuticals, information and communications technology sectors like semiconductors, AI, search, and others, and even emerging clean energy industries like electric vehicles and batteries to innovate and compete on a globally level playing field. It's vitally important to recognize that innovation-based industries are different than others. They're characterized by a need to achieve high economies of scale because the upfront cost of R&D and design are highly expensive, and companies need to be able to recoup investments from one generation of innovation to finance investment in the next. So it's the profits from the 10 nanometer fab that they get a 7 nanometer fab and the 5 nanometer fab. Likewise, it's the profits from one generation of biomedical innovation, like a cholesterol or a diabetes drug, that finances the investments needed for the next generation to tackle COVID-19 or treatments for Alzheimer's or cancers or other diseases we've never tackled before. So it's important that policymakers recognize the unique dynamics of innovation-based industries. Also, they're an important requirement that they achieve economies of scale in terms of sharing profits. The Global Trade and Innovation Alliance, the GTIPA, represents a network of over 40 leading global think tanks that have come together to collectively advance a vision that trade, globalization, and innovation conducted on market-based private enterprise rules-governed terms can maximize welfare for the world's citizens. Through its website at www.gtipa.org and our monthly newsletter, which we encourage you to sign up for at the website, the Alliance cross-posts members' reports and events so as to create a platform amplifying the global reach and influence of members' content and viewpoints. The Alliance also produces crowdsourced research, reports, and declarations. And today we're here for a discussion of a new GTIPA declaration titled Principles and Framework of Antitrust for Global Innovation, which argues that global policymakers need to take a dynamic analysis approach to antitrust policy, and that it's time to create a global antitrust framework with enforceable principles, in part to discipline nations that wish to use antitrust for protectionist measures. My colleague Aurélien Portuis, who is ITIF's Director of Antitrust and Innovation Policy and who leads our Schumpeter project on competition policy for the innovation economy, led creation of the declaration in concert with GTIPA members, and the declaration has been co-signed by numerous of our GTIPA colleagues. With that introduction to today's session, let me now introduce our panel and then turn it over to Aurélien, who will describe the declaration and be followed up by commentary from a panelist. Aurélien is an expert in U.S. antitrust and EU competition law and economics, who regularly writes and speaks at conferences, and whose book, Antitrust Populism, Competition Policy in the Digital Era, will be published this year by Oxford University Press. Aurélien is also an adjunct professor of law at the Global Antitrust Institute at George Mason University in the Washington, D.C. area, and at the Catholic University of Paris. Aurélien holds a law degree from the Sorbonne and also a master's from the London School of Economics. Frederick Jenny has been the chairman of the OECD Competition Committee since 1994 and is a professor at the ESSEC Paris Business School, ESSEC. He is also co-director of the European Center for Law and Economics at ESSEC. Frederick was previously non-executive director of the Office of Fair Trading in the United Kingdom for 7 years, a judge on the French Supreme Court from 2004 to August 2012, vice chair of the French Competition Authority for 9 years, and president of the WTO Working Group on Trade and Competition from 1997 to 2004. He has taught antitrust law at numerous law schools, including New York University, University College London, and Haifa in Israel. Natalia Gonzalez is Director of Legal and Legislative Affairs for Libertad y Desarrollo, our Chilean GTIPA member. A Fulbright scholar, she holds a law degree from the University of Chicago and Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Natalia has served as a legislative advisor in multiple Chilean government ministries, including the Ministries of Finance, Planning, and Energy. And she's been heavily involved in advising the ongoing Chilean constitutional reform efforts. Lastly, Stefano D'Ampoli is the president and principal policy analyst at ICON, the Institute for Competitiveness, a think tank based in Rome and Brussels, which he founded in 2005, and is another esteemed member of our Global Trade Innovation Policy Alliance. Stefano has authored numerous publications on economic topics and served as a key advisor in expert positions on a number of task force and scientific boards for the European Union and Commission. Stefano lectures in economics and law for the University of Rome and holds a master's in economics from George Mason University. So before I turn it over to Aurelian for this timely and stimulating discussion, let me note that we welcome audience questions via the Slido application, which you can find on the event webpage and also on the YouTube event webpage. We welcome your questions and we'll take them in the bottom half of the hour. With that, thank you. And Aurelian, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm very delighted to be a part of this event because it's such an important topic at a very important moment. Basically, antitrust has majoritarily remained domestic matter, and it also always remained within jurisdiction, even though antitrust policies and antitrust decisions, inherently have extra-territorial effects. And even though antitrust remained very domestic, we see that with the growing globalization and the concern for global innovations, we cannot ignore the extraterritorial effect of antitrust policies, and we really urgently need greater coordination, but also a better framework. I mean, just 2 weeks ago at the G7, we have the public statement where we found that the G7 countries has declared that they will try to find some coherent way to encourage competition and support innovation in digital markets. And so there's a real concern for a better coordination. And more specifically, at that G7 summit 2 weeks ago, there was this US and EU announcement that they will create a joint technology competition policy dialogue, where they really realized that now they need to better coordinate their antitrust policy, at least through the transatlantic. And that is a good step forward, but it's definitely not sufficient, in a sense that it is only limited to transatlantic dialogue, and the need is more a global dialogue where you have a multilateral discussion on antitrust policies. I mean, in the G7 summit in Paris in 2019, there was already this need for international cooperation between competition policies. And over the last 2 years, we haven't seen much progress. And so I think with the concerns about how the antitrust policy are developed and implemented, and how the frictions can just appear between antitrust policy, I think we really need not transatlantic or soft law instruments. We really need a global framework with multilateral rules and legally binding rules for international antitrust. And I'm very pleased to have contributed to this declaration you just mentioned, Stephen, because I think it's a very unique, very original, and very groundbreaking proposal, in a sense that we have in this declaration, we have some three statements and an actionable course for improving international antitrust. So the first statement is to recognize that at the WTO, we need to reactivate the working group on competition policy. Very strangely, there is a working group on competition policy at the WTO, which existed until 2004. And for some reasons, this working group has been silenced, and its mandate has ceded. So I think with the growing concerns of the fact that some countries may use antitrust for mercantilistic and trade as a trade distortive tool, I think the real need to reactivate this working group is a very, very important, so that it will also include every countries in the world, not only developed countries, but also those countries in any continents. So not only we have to have a reactivation of the working group, but we need to have principles and rules that lay down some common understanding of what is anti-competitive and what is allowed for companies to distort competition through hidden subsidies or hidden distortive tools. And I think the WTO is the right level of enforceability because precisely we have a dispute settlement mechanism and we have legally binding rules which can be adopted and implemented. Obviously, we have a number of fora, like we have the OECD, we have the International Competition Network, we have a number of guidelines which are very important, very useful. I'm sure Frederick going to have a word on that very next to me. But it's still not sufficient in the sense that either not all the countries are included or only soft law instruments are within the reach of those fora. I think we need both a multilateral framework and legally binding principles so that antitrust could not and should not be used as a trade distortive tool. I mean, we can take a number of examples. For example, some states, some countries may not want to prosecute or at least to investigate cartels because they are domestic, and they may be using cartels as a way to have a more mercantilist policy and to export and to gain market shares globally. That's not playing with the same rules. Also, we have many frictions regarding mergers. Some mergers may be approved in some countries, and the very same mergers may not be approved in other countries. And this is a real impediment for companies that most of the time operate globally and where their market is, of course, the global market. So we need these very simple rules where we not only have multilateral rules at the WTO, but also the WTO can lay down some rules for stronger cooperation between antitrust agencies. But this stronger cooperation between antitrust agencies is really not sufficient in itself, and we need stronger principles at the WTO. It's very surprising that the WTO has been so silent about competition policy and antitrust more generally, precisely as the globalization and the digitalizations has been ever increasing over the last 20 years. So I think it's time to reactivate this working group, and this working group will precisely provide the best location for developing those rules. And with that, I think it's very promising. We will not only rely on transatlantic antitrust, where we have a cooperation between the US and the EU, but we'll be much more inclusive with a global discussion. And that will potentially prevent some regulatory and initiatives that are creating frictions. We can see that between, for example, the Digital Market Act in the EU, as opposed to what the American can think of that act as being trade distortive. So I think there's a number of concerns that can be settled within a global framework. And also, of course, we need to have the big players and every big players within that multilateral framework. And I can think of course, China, in the sense that Chinese company also have to play by the rules of fair competition so that every company in the world, I mean, need to be part of these global competition and that fosters global innovation. If some countries, if some governments try to free ride and try to not play by the rules of fair competition, then it's the overall global welfare that will be undermined. So I think the declaration that we just issued is very timely, as we saw for the last few weeks with the G7. But it's now very urgent to have the WTO really doing something about that. And of course, this is supplementary to the the current fora, like the OECD and the International Competition Network, their expertise will, of course, be very useful for helping designing those rules at the WTO. So it's very complementary and not as a substitute, that those expertise in order to design international rules of antitrust can foster innovation and competition globally. So now I yield back to Frederick.
Thank you very much, Aurélien, for this. And let me say right at the beginning that in part of the debates that you have set up, which is a question of whether we need hard rules that will be enforced by the WTO or soft rules, which are what the OECD produces, I'm completely agnostic, being the chairman of the OECD Competition Committee, but having been the chair of the Working Group on Trade and Competition at the WTO. So let me go back a little bit on the history. The issue of convergence in competition law and cooperation has a long history. The first OECD recommendation on the question was in 1967. And then there was a revision of it and a kind of more developed recommendation in 1995. And then in 2013, we did with the ICN, so at the world level, way beyond the OECD members, an analysis of cooperation that was taking place, and realized that there was very little cooperation, in fact, taking place. And so in 2014, there was a new recommendation. So cooperation has increased. It has been on the map for a long time, but there are still quite a way to go. Now, on the agenda, both at the WTO and at the OECD, the issues were both cooperation, more cooperation, and convergence. And one of the proposals of the EU at the time in the working group was that every country should have an anti-cartel provision. That would be the first thing. And second, that every country, for every possible transnational cartel, would help the competition authority of the affected countries, according to a commitment made in the WTO. There was not much, and I must say that historically there hasn't been much issue about a strategic use of competition policy. There has been an issue about the fact that sometimes when you make a decision, let's say, on how the owner of a patent should behave, because sometimes when you have a patent, you also have a dominant position, which may be true in one country or in many countries. And I'm thinking here, of course, of components, for example, for digital components. Sometimes the competition authority will mandate that the owner of an intellectual property piece should behave in a certain way, and this will have an extraterritorial reach because the firm just cannot behave differently depending on where the intellectual property is licensed. So we do have extraterritorial consequences of decisions, but I haven't not been aware of the fact that there has been a great debate, maybe there should have been, but there hasn't been a great debate on the strategic use of, for protectionist reasons, of competition law throughout the world. In any case, so cooperation has developed quite considerably, but in a very particular way, mostly bilateral agreements between firms where you choose with which jurisdiction you want to cooperate. Second, within those agreements, you choose which cases you want to cooperate on. Okay. And so this voluntary mechanism has led to a very spotty picture of cooperation. There's intense cooperation between the EU, the US, Japan, between the big guys, I would say, and much less cooperation with the smaller jurisdictions or jurisdictions which are more different, which have more different legal systems in particular. The basis on which this cooperation has developed is basically the idea of positive committee and negative committee, the fact that a country should try to not to inflict damage on another country and should help the other country enforce its own laws. The obstacles have been numerous. Very often, competition authorities do not have the right to exchange confidential information with other jurisdictions. So there have been issues there. There have been progress, and we've seen the development of new instruments of cooperation, like waivers, which is when there is an investigation on a cartel, for example, which may have some implications, extra-territorial implication. A competition authority which is investigating gets the approval of the firm to exchange confidential information with other jurisdictions in order to facilitate the investigation. And there have been information gateways, which are laws that allow, in fact, competition authorities to exchange confidential information. So there's been a little bit of development, but still we have a spotty and limited cooperation when it comes to cooperation on cases. When it comes to cooperation on thinking about issues, there is much more cooperation. Okay. So what is new in a sense? Well, what's new? It's the digital sector and the competition issue raised by some of the very largest ecosystems in the world. And there are two levels of issue. There is one level which has to do with convergence, really, which is how do you analyze those competition issues? And the reason why there's a need to converge is because it's baffling for competition authorities how one should analyze those competition issues, because ecosystems are not like firms. They are not attached to a market. Through artificial intelligence, whoever has the most data may end up giving a better quality service. So we may have an issue of a trade-off between competition and quality. So all kinds of things are different in the digital sector, and we cannot easily use our traditional instruments. For example, we use price-cost margin as an example of market power. Now, on many digital markets, the price is equal to zero. So price-cost margin does not have any sense. Okay. So there's a first issue, which is to have the community of competition authorities come to a common understanding of how one can look at competition in the digital sector. Okay. So there's a second dimension, which is the fact that at least for the worldwide ecosystems, if you think of Facebook or Amazon or Apple, they behave the same way all over the world. They are aterritorial by definition. So which means that the competition issues are pretty much the same in all countries. And you can have two systems, a system where every jurisdiction goes after its own cases, and there's a large duplication of cases throughout the world. But this is a terrible waste of resources. It is both a waste of resources because you replicate the same kind of analysis over and over again, and B, in many jurisdictions, is going to eat up all the resources of the competition authority, and therefore there's going to be under enforcement elsewhere. Okay. So there is clearly a need for new forms of cooperation, I would say, between among competition authorities, to try to invent legal instruments that were talked about in the past but have not been adopted, such as mutual recognition of decisions, so that a competition authority of a country doesn't have to redo the whole analysis, but can adopt a decision which has been taken by a foreign competition authority, for example. And the digital sector, at least the worldwide platforms, raise those issues, because in every country, there is the question of whether they treat, there are two questions. How do they compete between themselves, but also how do they compete within each ecosystem with the complementers? And those issues are exactly the same everywhere. So I think that there is a renewed interest in pushing cooperation. Last word, should it be in the WTO? I think that Aurélien put it very clearly. He said, there are benefits to the WTO. One of them is that it's hard rules. And the second one is that it has a dispute settlement mechanism. But the first quality, I would say, of the WTO, which has been outlined, may in fact be a weakness, because it may be more difficult to arrive at hard rules, because you have to keep in mind that the objective of competition law is not the same in every country in the world, and that nearly half of the countries, even if I take the OECD, have public interest provisions or goals in their competition law. And this includes the EU, by the way. One of the things that the EU does is to promote the single market, which is not what the Sherman Act is trying to do. And that leads to a different approach, certainly a different approach of vertical restraints, but there are also many other implications. Okay. So I think that going for hard rules at the world level is going to be particularly complicated, because I actually believe that we must accept a modicum of differences between competition laws, because we are talking about countries that have different levels of development, different history, different legal systems, and you cannot have complete convergence in those areas. But on horizontal matters, for example, competition authorities throughout the world, I mean, the 130 competition authorities have pretty much arrived at the similar kind of approval. Where things are not so homogeneous or coherent or consistent is in the area of abuse of dominance. I would say that merger control is pretty much unified, and that's the area where economics has been the unifying force of this. But certainly abuse of dominance is an area where there are differences of sensitivities across jurisdictions. And where getting a hard rule might be a bit difficult. So there are advantages and costs of doing it in the WTO. Having said that, I want to turn it over to Natalia.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Very interesting. And just as you were saying, in our case, in Chile, the extraterritorial effects of the antitrust rules can be mostly observed in the process of assessing the competitive effects of concentration operation, right, between competitors, mostly merger operations or acquisitions in which our antitrust authorities have been involved and that have extraterritorial effects. As you all know, our rules in Chile have evolved significantly in this regard. Over the last decade, we first had a voluntary pre-merger control system, which was much criticized actually by the OCDE due to the uncertainties arising from this process, where the Chilean competition watchdogs could actually turn over an already closed deal. So it moved in 2017 to a final mandatory regime that is effective as of June 2017. So now we have a mandatory pre-merger control that has replaced the voluntary old filing regime. In this new merger control, almost every operation that will be described as a merger fits in, either if it is a merge, an acquisition, an association, or an acquisition of control. They get into the scope of our antitrust authorities. In this system, as I was saying, it's mandatory to notify any projected transactions to the National Economic Prosecutor's Office. He will examine the transaction. He will see if he and his team, of course, assess if there is a reduction, substantial reduction of competition in the market. The threshold that we look, it's how much business will the merging firms transact in Chile? How much do they transact in Chile and the results of that? So it's a very local perspective. Also, there's a share acquisition reporting requirement when there is such an operation. And this regime consists in two phases, actually. One phase in which the prosecutor can unconditionally approve the operation, approve it with conditions, or move further to a more extensive or comprehensive investigation for another 90 days, where he or she has the same alternatives, or finally prohibit the operation. And the parties can't go ahead unless the authorization, the clearance is granted. So we have a process of review. The tribunal, the competition tribunal here in Chile, may review the decision of the prosecutor if the prosecutor prohibits the operation. And in that case, the tribunal may allow the operation to continue, subject to the remedies proposed by one of the applicants, or it may also approve further remedies, further conditions, and in that case, the decision may be subject to review by the Supreme Court. And when we look at our regime, which is similar to other countries, this transition from a voluntary to a mandatory merger control regime has brought, of course, legal certainty in the area of mergers of horizontal operations. Because the previous voluntary system, as I was saying, the competition authorities were nevertheless authorized to unwind already completed concentration operations. And so if they found that they were harmful to competition, so uncertainty was around the table. And our antitrust authorities, specifically the Chilean prosecutor, has issued, it has been very efficient in issuing guidelines, following, of course, the recommendations of the international organisms, but also following the path of the US and the European regulators, providing information to the relevant markets and to the relevant interested parties about how would the prosecutor will proceed in these cases, with special emphasis, of course, of levels of concentration, barriers to entry, unilateral and coordinated effects, among others. So there is some, as I would say, learning procedure from our authorities, from the international experiences, from the international organizations in this regard, and our legislation has been improved. We have many relevant cases, cross-border cases that have been studied by our Chilean authority. We have the LANTAM case. This is the pre the amendment of our law. It was a voluntary procedure. This involved the Brazilian and the Chilean authorities. This case consisted in the merger of these two airlines, and it will result in the largest airline in South America. It was submitted for approval. In both jurisdictions, it was approved, and both jurisdictions imposed structural and behavioral remedies or measures, such as divestments, such as prohibitions to increase seats available in the relevant Sao Paulo-Santiago route, obligation to withdraw, for example, from the global alliances from which LAN and TAM belonged before the merger. We had the Maersk Line Hamburg Sud acquisition, also reviewed by the Chilean prosecutor office. It was approved, also subject to several acquisition conditions regarding the commercial routes and the participation of these companies in vessel sharing agreements. We had the Bayer-Monsanto merger also, which was, it garnered considerable antitrust scrutiny worldwide, right? The European Commission approved it in March 2018. Then in June, Chile's competition authorities did likewise, also considering a very important remedies package in order to prevent conglomerate associated risks. This was also addressed by Brazil, by Mexico, by China, by Russia, by Canada, by South Africa. So, of course, we see that in this kind of operations, it's relevant that the authorities more or less follow similar principles, similar structures, because if the operation is canceled in one jurisdiction, that usually determines the results or the following of the operation in the other jurisdictions. Now, recently, and into this dynamic approach, in times of this rapid technological changes, right, where markets are evolving rapidly based on the firm's dynamic capabilities, our antitrust authorities, I would say, are also starting to provide a more dynamic approach to antitrust in accordance with the nature of the markets and the characteristics of today's competition and innovation. This approach, I would say, may depart from the traditional static approach that usually said, right, atomized markets with many players are deemed to be better because they foster competition. But I think that our authorities are approaching a long-term consumer welfare standing this factual assessment that they're making on the relevant cases that I will comment in a minute that have been submitted to their knowledge are starting to being analyzed or assessed through other perspectives. I'm referring specifically in this analytical framework in which they would consider, for example, the indirect entry on digital platforms from a dynamic perspective. They're starting to identify competitive pressures as a part of this framework. And it's also doing an effort to understand the rationality of the big tech behavior and what are their incentives. The latter cases in this regard, I would like to mention especially one of them. We had a recent case in 2019 where a successful startup Chilean company, tech firm, Cornershop, was acquired by the big tech Uber. Cornershop is a delivery grocery goods app that connects consumers with several stores and brings the goods and the groceries to your home. And Uber filed a petition to acquire a majority stake in this grocery delivery startup here in Chile. This startup operates in Chile, in Mexico, Peru, and Canada, and it was also by the time looking to expand its operations to the US. The analysis that the Antitrust Authority did here was not only about consumer surplus in the static approach or the welfare on the short term, but it also embraced the dynamic efficiencies and innovation. In particular, what the authority looked carefully to was the possibility that the operation would reduce, of course, Uber and Cornershop incentives to innovate in other areas of e-commerce. And if it would allow access to information regarding its consumers that would affect its competitors. And it finally concluding, doing a very thorough analysis that other actors or parties had sufficient incentives in this market to innovate. Especially there was a rush by supermarket chains into the e-commerce and online platforms. This case was analyzed, the latter part of the case, during the pandemic. So during 2019, we had an explosive demand in supermarket groceries, and that determined certain changes in this market and certain changes in the behavior of Cornershop and of the other actors involved. So the prosecutor had that into consideration as well. He couldn't gather sufficient evidence that this would undermine the conditions of the market. So it finally approved the operation without any conditions, without any structural or behavioral measures imposed, as in the other questions. So the big question that arises here, from my point of view, after reviewing these latter cases of the Chilean Antitrust Authority regarding tech companies, is whether we have the tools here in Chile and worldwide to make this dynamic analysis approach. Is it enough with the traditional tools? Friedrich was saying recently, like, is it enough? The price, of course, it's not. Many operate with free goods and services for consumers, at least. Is it enough, the traditional market and market share definition, to assess market power in these cases? I don't think so. I think that the antitrust authorities should start considering embracing dynamic efficiencies and innovation entries. They should consider also, I know that they operate more or less the same in the different jurisdictions, but the different applications and the different platforms and the digital ecosystem as a whole has different business models. They have different strategies to monetize the value. They have different types of economics of scale. The direction of the network's effects can be different, and the potential for disintermediation as well. So I think that many of the problems that we're now facing are actually in the tools. We need to improve the tools, and we also need, I believe, to improve or develop new theories of harm in digital ecosystems. They're not necessarily the same harms that we can see in traditional markets or in traditional systems. And we need to understand if those harms are all of them going to be tackled by antitrust regulation or not. I believe antitrust is not ubiquitous. Antitrust has specific objectives and further effects or further harms that these platforms may be creating, such as, for example, privacy issues, such as issues that could deal with consumer protection issues, or even political issues such as fake news or how they affect democracy, are not things that are properly or should be embraced by antitrust, but are more of other pieces of legislation, as I was saying before, Consumer Protection Act, Privacy Act, or other acts that would tend to improve those other, to take charge of those other harms. I don't think antitrust is intended to prevent the non-economic effects that these big tech firms or conglomerates across multiple markets may cause. So this is important because if we're talking about a framework or principles, we should be also aware about not trying to cause bigness in the law and introduce discretion in the decision-making process. I think that would be something really harmful at the end of the day for the analysis of these cases. This is important in times where this debate is highly polarized and politicized as well. Several complaints are being filed against the big tech giants in every side of the planet, I would say. And some theories of bigness as being bad itself are imposing in some of the analysis that some jurisdictions could be making. And it could be imposing over the consumer warfare theory that I think works better in this scenario, although we have to improve the tools, as I was saying. So do we need ex-ante regulation? I think we do. We need to complement competition regulation. I don't think that regulation should divert to other objectives, as I was saying before. But we also need to improve the tools to make enforcement better, to make enforcement go to in the speed that the velocity of the change in the digital world goes. What kind of regulation? I don't believe in frameworks or in principles that would impose blacklists, because those blacklists or absolute prohibitions won't admit efficiency defenses, which I think in this case is something particularly important. I think these principles, these frameworks that we are promoting should allow a case-by-case review that accounts for this heterogeneity, that accounts for the fact that one size probably won't fit all. So regulatory initiatives are coming up. We have the Digital Markets Act. We have this UK new pro-competition regime. I understand that Germany passed recently a reform to its Competition Act, and we have the bipartisan bills in the US. So this is a very important topic today. And what we're trying to do here and with this declaration is that these regulatory approaches would follow eventually similar principles. And we believe that perhaps either the World Trade Organization or other established multilateral institution could set up this path for this suggested framework and principles, assisted, of course, by important forums such as the OCDE. But a principle-based approach, we believe, is better than a final rigid checklist. And with that said, I would pass the word to Stefano.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think speaking of the European Union, you have basically two different orders of problems due to the, of course, to the particular institution. I mean, you have basically the Commission that has very important powers, but you have also powers, especially in the enforcement at national level. So basically you have that the enforcement at national level not always consistent on a continental scale, and enforcement at EU level not consistent with other jurisdictions. For the first, enforcement at national level not always consistent on a continental scale. Here, I mean, you have this is true for, of course, for antitrust suits proceedings concerning local players, but also for multinational ones, especially in the digital area. That is, of course, relatively new area in antitrust sense. You have different antitrust cases in concerning the usual ones, Google, Facebook, Amazon, taking place at member state level in different member states at once. But also not always, not only US companies, but also think of Bookings, European platform that was under different proceedings in different countries, like Germany and Italy, for example, similar issues and with different positions and decisions by the national authorities. So there is an issue of fragmentation that is quite important. It is perceived quite important by the same commission, and one of the most important discussions concerning the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, at this moment is on the powers to give to national authorities, to member states. The Commission, in its proposal, the standard proposal, would like to have a minimum amount of powers given to national states, to member states, while the member states, and especially the most important ones, France and Germany, wants to have their say on DMA and on DMA enforcement, of course, and also on they would have, in any case, their say on revisions of DMA, of course, being the council, playing a role, an important role in revisions of legislation, but they want to have their say also in enforcement. And then the second issue that is quite alike in other, of course, jurisdictions is the fact that the enforcement at EU level, of course, could be not consistent with other countries, other jurisdictions. And I see a very important area, given the specific and peculiar nature of the EU in the state aid enforcement. We have a very important and very severe state aid rules in Europe. Actually, they have been slightly relaxed, not that slightly, actually, quite significantly relaxed with the COVID crisis. But in any case, in ordinary time, they are quite severe, and they target, of course, European companies operating, in some markets, trying to foster the single market, as Frederick said before. And so they want to leave the competition open to companies from all the states, even the smaller ones, of course. The idea here is that without state aid rules, especially companies backed by strong and larger countries could win to the detriment of smaller countries, other companies operating in the same markets. And but the idea here is that there is a geographical notion corresponding with Europe, and without considering basically other that competition could be at global level, in many sectors. And so I think in this case, it could discriminate against European companies, especially when you have companies from other jurisdictions. Think of China, of course, but not only of China. Gain from massive state aid from their respective countries. So in this respect, I think coordination could be very beneficial to European companies. And there is also, I mean, more or less the same could happen for mergers, even if here, I mean, you can discuss a little bit more about single cases. Of course, the last battleground in Europe was the Siemens-Alstom merger in rail. And actually, the merger was that was basically an acquisition of Alstom by Siemens. Was turned down by the European Commission because basically the European Commission didn't buy the argument that there was a Chinese leader that was basically much bigger than also the Alstom Siemens new entity after the merger. And they didn't buy it because they said that in any case, the Chinese player had a negligible presence in Europe, and so it was not a serious competitor to Alstom Siemens that could become de facto monopolist in Europe, in the European market. Yes and no. Of course, I mean, you can. I mean, if you base the argument on a, I mean, static efficiency criteria, yeah, probably they were right. In dynamical terms, of course, you can question the argument because you can think that the Chinese player, for instance, could have more resources to invest in research and development. And in any case, yeah, now it's not present in Europe and maybe not really present in other markets. But in 10 years or 15 years or 7 years, it could become an important international player, and not only in China, where it has, for now at least, a huge market because China is investing a lot in as it is well known in railways and so also rail machinery and so on. But this question is also relates also to cases where antitrust, European antitrust, is maybe helping, I mean, some countries, some member states against others. Here I'm referring to other cases, other recent cases, especially, I mean, as an Italian, to someone where an Italian player was supposed to buy a French player. Of course, there are many other players that can be quoted, but this is fresh in my mind. In the shipbuilding sector, Fincantieri was buying a majority stake in Chantier de l'Atlantique, a French shipbuilding companies. They would create a very important player, especially in the cruise market. And basically, you had, I mean, the one government, the French government, that clearly, I mean, try to resist this acquisition, and this fact plus the uncertainty concerning I mean, the decisions by the European Commission, I mean, gave a final blow to the deal. And of course, it's another case where probably if you were thinking in global terms, not only European terms, I mean, thinking of a global market, the decision could be easily different. And so these, as I said before, I mean, these, I mean, you can quote many other cases. I mean, it was not the only case, but where basically a friction, I mean, among member states, plus, I mean, uncertainty concerning, I mean, the European Commission decisions could discriminate European companies against other companies. And then you have the usual topics, thinking of course, in the last decades, many deals concerning, for example, for instance, American companies were approved in the US while rejected in the European Union. And probably that I mean, a stronger coordination could be helpful. I don't see, of course, I mean, I agree at least in part with Frederic that we are not thinking of an only antitrust law for I mean, every for different countries, and you can have different antitrust laws, but coordination, I think, is really needed. Having in mind, I mean, that innovation, I mean, has to be pursued, and it's a very important driver of the economic growth. Also, I mean, most studies clearly show in empirical terms. And uncertainty at the same time is one of the drivers that obstruct economic growth and innovation. So I think really coordination could be beneficial to everyone, even if maybe for different reasons. For sure, it could be beneficial also to Europe. And of course, I'm turning to
Excellent.
Steven,
Well,
to the
thank you so
moderator.
much, Stefano. Really appreciate those comments. Want to invite our viewership to ask any questions they have via the Slido application. And as we get started with our moderated part of the discussion here, I just want to ask the panelists if they would like to react to or extend upon anything they heard one of their fellow panelists say. You know, I was struck by Natalia talking about potentially the need for new tools or even new definitions or principles of harm. That might be something to discuss, or anything else you might want to react to, fellow panelists. Can
I react to some of the things that have been said and some of the things which haven't been said?
Yes, please, Frederic.
I did point out the fact that there were pluses and minuses of having hard rules. At the level of so many countries. I mean, the membership of the WTO is very daunting from this point of view. But what I didn't say is I think that there was an extremely positive result of the working group between 2000 and 2004. It failed, you're absolutely right. But I think that the development of competition law and the development of cooperation after that is one of the byproducts. It raised the awareness of the issues, which didn't exist in many countries so much before the debate. So that was something positive, and that led to more cooperation and more consistency. So maybe bringing this issue again in the WTO, even if it fails to get to hard rules, could be useful for the same reason, by raising the awareness. The second thing I wanted to say is that I think it's Aurélien who said that there was not much cooperation on mergers. If there's one area of competition law where there's quite a bit I mean, you know, it's spotty, it's only you cooperate with friends, but there has been quite a bit of cooperation on remedies recently. And the reason is that when you have a transnational mergers, if two competition authorities arrive with remedies which are inconsistent, everybody loses. And from that point of view, you have to keep in mind the fact that maybe the larger part of the cooperation is informal. It is not necessarily the implementation of a formal cooperation agreement, which are limited for all kinds of reasons, but it is competition authorities talking to each other and saying, well, I'm thinking of adopting this behavioral remedy or this structural remedy. What you have the same merger within the same time framework. What are you thinking about, and do they match? And that takes place. And the result is that there are many fewer fights among countries over mergers than there were in the 1990s, where there were mergers which were looked at by the European Commission and the US became very upset and vice versa. Okay. So, second point. The third point is I saw that there was a question from the audience.
Yes, go ahead. Let me just read two of them to you, Frederick, and then you can respond and others can. One of the audience questions is, do you see the WTO dispute settlement timelines slowing or impeding merger clearances if the WTO does not or does take an active role in mergers? And another question, and again, they're here on the screen for all the panelists, but do not the differences in goals among different competition agencies create a major impediment to competition-related WTO dispute settlement?
So very shortly on those, I mean, first of all, I think that the fact that there may be slightly different goals to competition law is something which makes the adoption of a unified rule a bit more difficult. Okay, so that's clear. It's not going to help facilitate the negotiation in the WTO. The second point is I don't believe that I mean, there could be a particular procedure. We all know that mergers need to be solved fairly rapidly. And what happens in every country is that, unlike for other anti-competitive practices, in the case of merger control, there are special expedited procedures to make sure that the solution of the case comes at a time which is relevant for the firms. And I think the same thing could happen in the WTO. You know, the dispute settlement mechanism is a pretty efficient and pretty fast way of solving disputes. There's a lot of resources which is put in the mechanism, but if you compare it with the mechanism in courts, for example, in national jurisdictions, it goes much, much faster. So I don't think that this is too much of a problem. I saw that there was another question which had to do with the rise of nationalism in Europe and whether there was a link with competition. And I think there is one, to be honest. I think that what happens is, in theory, all the firms have the same environment, legal environment, institutional environment. So that's why we don't talk about it, because it's the same for everybody. In reality, when you negotiate international trade agreements and you create international competition, you do it among countries that do not have the same legal system, do not have the same level of development, etc., do not have the same constraints in terms of environment or climate change. And okay, so what you create is a somewhat unequal competition. So that's the first issue. And this is a very clear issue with China, for example, when China joined the WTO. The second one is that economic theory is based on the idea that the winners will compensate the losers, and that just doesn't take place in real life. Okay, so if you are a steel mill worker in Pennsylvania, you lose your job, and nobody from China is going to come and compensate you for the loss of your job. And the third thing is that in theory, people can move from one function to another very easily. I mean, labor is mobile, like all resources, which is a fiction, because, you know, you've got a house somewhere, okay? If it's in a depressed area, you can't sell it. And if you sell it, you certainly won't have the money to buy a new one elsewhere. Plus, you have a husband or you have a wife who may have a different job and is not as mobile as you are, okay? So there are all kinds of reasons. Negotiators have not taken sufficient account of the fact that to go from theory to practice, you have a number of steps, and you have to anticipate the fact that there should be some compensation mechanism or some mechanism to facilitate the reallocation of resources, which don't take place. And this is what has led to the rise of populism in the UK, in Europe, and in the US. It's people who've been displaced by globalization, not because competition was bad, but because unfair competition or unequal competition doesn't lead to the result that we were expecting.
I think those are excellent points, Frederick, and I agree with virtually all of them. Other panelists wish to react to what Frederick has just said, to the questions that have been submitted by the audience, or to things you've heard from your fellow panelists.
I think I can react very quickly to Frederick's point. It is very interesting what you all said from the historical point of view, but also the working group. You're completely right that the work that's taken place until 2004 was valuable. And you're completely right that it is a daunting task, but surprisingly, we can achieve some little steps, baby steps, toward these coordination. So the task is daunting, but it's not impossible. And it's very surprising with this globalized world we live in that we just not even try. And you're completely right. We may fail, but we are bound to try. And I think it's just not thinkable that, just to your last point on globalization and populism, with the rise of populism, with the resentment against globalization by those who are displaced, we do not strive for fair competition with legally binding rules. And I think fair competition will make globalization more acceptable and more just accepted by everybody. And so it's not only an economic and a legal concern, it's also a political objective of making globalizations more acceptable and just more humanistic, if you want. On mergers, I think you're completely right. This is an area where there's probably some cooperation, and we just saw it, for example, with the pharma mergers, where we have the US antitrust authorities with the European and UK authorities, which set up some working group in order to better coordinate their approach to pharma merger. That's great, but again, it's only a small club of countries. If you have the US, the EU, and the UK, how does it sound in Australia or in Chile or in South Africa? It doesn't sound like a proper way of regulating globalization. And I mean, you're very well placed because you worked with developing countries. I think it's very important to have those developing countries on board. And I think there's no better place than the WTO. And so for all these reasons, if we want to have something inclusive and to really create a fair level playing field, which is inherent to fair competition, we cannot escape to reactivate this working group at the WTO. So, yeah.
I'm ready.
Natalia?
Yes, I completely agree with Arlene and also taking what Frederick was saying. I mean, for in developing countries, as in Chile, as I was saying before, we're always looking to the guidelines, to the experience of developed countries as well, and that have the experience of analyzing wider and cross-borders operations, perhaps in a larger scale than we get to have. However, this is every day more frequent, and in different markets, such as in the big tech markets, I think all of us have much to learn. When it comes to this markets, we have many dimensions to analyze. And antitrust has a say, not in all of those dimensions, as I was saying, but of course it has a say. And because it's not so evident, for example, to consumers, how would eventually an antitrust conduct would eventually harm them or damage them. As I was saying, the usual theories don't necessarily apply to these cases. So, and since this develops very quickly, very rapidly, and we're all connected and involved, it's harder perhaps for developing nations to be looking to what developed nations will be doing, because they're also probably behind also. So this kind of a multilateral approach, guided by an established institution such as the World Trade Organization, could give the initial, at least the initial support to an initiative like this, like to promote common principles, to promote a common framework. I think we're not trying to be such an ambitious alliance to say that we need one legal piece for all the jurisdictions. No, we know the differences, we know the objectives, but at least a principle-based orientation that many countries, including developing countries, would share and would participate in that creation. I think specifically facing this new developing industries would be great.
If I may add one thing as a reaction to, I don't know who said that the developing countries are left out. I mean, that's partly true, but it's not entirely true. I was on a debate on a similar issue about a week ago, and the representative of the South African Commission was saying it's much easier for us, the South African Competition Commission, to cooperate with the US than it is to cooperate with Kenya.
Sure.
Even within developing countries, there are gaps, and so I think it's mostly a question of cooperation is easy and is promoted among countries that have a lot of trade or that are important to each other for some reason, but trade could be a good reason. And as soon as you deal with countries with whom you don't trade a lot, well, there is no interest in cooperating because it's not important for your trade. So I entirely agree on the fact that there's a connection between trade and competition. They are complementary. And I think that the spottiness of cooperation is too bad. It's not entirely a developing issue because, as I said, but it is an issue that needs to be attended to.
Sure.
A new question from the audience. What about agreements to combat anti-competitive market distortions with a potential tarification remedy for distortions that have not been withdrawn?
Well, one of the issues, at least, that we faced in a discussion in the working group on trade and competition at the WTO was the fact that, on the one hand, I mean, it's fairly clear that there are transnational cartels which are very damaging to a lot of countries, and I think of potash, but there are plenty of other examples. On the other hand, it is equally clear that a lot of developed or developing countries like to have export cartels. So whether you talk about cocoa, or you talk about rubber, or you talk about rice, all of a sudden the interest, or jute, or for India, the interest of the developing country changes. And so they would like to get rid of the cartels that they're victims of, but not of the ones that promote their export. So that's a question about, but it is clearly a question which is close to what Aurélien was saying. The fact that you impose a cost on others by saying, well, an export cartel is not my problem, so I don't deal with it. It must be someone else's problem. Yes, but what the WTO effort was trying to do was to say, in those circumstances, if the victims of a cartel, whether it's the cocoa cartel or the rubber cartel or the potash cartel, enlist the help of the countries where the cartel is located, then that country should help that victim to try to get redress or to eliminate the cartel.
Aurélien, I want to ask you a question about an ITIF report we released earlier this month called "No Monopoly Has Not Grown." And the report finds that, despite widespread claims of monopolization, just 4% of U.S. industries are highly concentrated. And actually, the share of industries, when you look at C4 industry concentration levels, the share with low levels of concentration actually grew by around 25% from 2002 to 2017. This research, maybe kind of different than what might be commonly expected among U.S. policymakers. I'd like you to comment upon that, and also, do we have any evidence of what these trends and dynamics are like in other nations? And is there opportunity for the OECD, for instance, to collaborate on an instrument that would allow for the capturing of that type of information more broadly across OECD countries to better understand concentration of monopoly?
Right. So sorry, just on the report very quickly. Yeah, this report was just showed that there was no concentration in the U.S. economy, and I think we can see that in other economy, also in the European Union. But I think it's very important to go beyond these concentration concerns and to look at anti-competitive conduct, and that's a ground for better coordination, irrespectively of concentrations, which may not always be evidence and demonstrated. Yeah. Frederick, sorry.
When we look, because of course we have looked at those issues, there are a couple of difficulties. One of them is that, yes, it is true that at the aggregate level, but the level of aggregation, which is not really relevant for competition, which is a much higher level, at the level of sectors, I would say, there's been quite a bit of increase in concentration in the US, much more than in the EU. And in the US, the debates comes not only from the fact that concentration has increased, but profit margin have increased. So that's where some people have argued that in the US, the increase in concentration has meant that there's been less competition. And there are a couple of additional things. There are fewer firms that leave industries and coming into industries. In Europe, we haven't been on the same trend. First of all, margins have not increased particularly. Concentration has increased somewhat. But then the question is whether concentration has increased because we have those enormous ecosystems which have developed, and that in itself would, at the aggregate level at least, increase concentration, or whether concentration has increased on relevant competition markets, the kind of markets that competition authorities deal with. And there, the evidence is much less obvious that there has been at least in Europe or in the rest of the world, that the movement that has been observed in the US is that strong in the rest of the world. So it seems to be more of a US problem.
And why does that happen? Sorry, it's interesting. Do you have any theories?
There are different theories, and different economists have. Some economists have said, well, it's because the antitrust authorities in the US have been very inactive. They have not prevented all kinds of mergers that should never have taken place. And this is what people, the new Brandeis school is arguing, basically. You have other people who say, no, that's because there's been much more innovation in the US and therefore much more development of the digital sector with enormous firms. And this has had some others say, well, this is because we allow common ownership of firms. So that reduces the incentive of firms to compete with each other. And that's why the margins have increased.
The margins may actually be a value of
many theories
that the industries create for society as well.
Yeah.
I want to wrap it up at 11:25 because several of our panelists here have to get on to other meetings. So that gives us about 7 minutes left. I do want to ask Natalia, Stefano, you talked about dynamic approach to antitrust policy. Could you talk maybe what the pros, cons, and challenges are of more thinking around antitrust policy? Do antitrust regulators around the world have the competencies in place to be able to look at markets in a dynamic way? And maybe we could wrap our conversation up here for the next 5 minutes or so, just around the nature of thinking in new ways about antitrust policy.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. As I was saying, I don't think we have right now a good set of tools, like a toolbox, like a proper set of toolbox to analyzing this from a dynamic approach. For example, I was just writing some notes while I was hearing you. But for example, we have several problems. Like as Frederick was saying, it's difficult to approach to harm if we have free goods. Usually the goods that are offered in these platforms, at least from the consumer perspective, sometimes he doesn't even pay, right? Then you have to ask yourself, well, then is the other side of the platform being exploited somehow? Could be something to analyze. Do they expropriate information, for example? Are these harms like privacy or even hate speech? Is this a horizontal problem? I don't think so. Should these parallel regulations complement antitrust? Maybe, but it's not properly antitrust analysis. And then you have all the discussion about what happens in the tipped markets and in the non-tipped markets. Some say that we have to prevent monopoly rent in the tipped markets and be aware of competitive pressures in the non-tipped markets. But then you ask yourself, but why do we want specifically to prevent increasing rents in the tipped markets if this is perhaps causing a major welfare in the whole lot of consumers? So it's complicated. It's really complicated. So I don't think that nowadays the antitrust authorities are really prepared to address all these issues with the traditional tools. That's my point. And that we need to work in principles, in frameworks, but also on how to improve and tackle better tools to analyze these issues that the big tech cases will impose.
First of all, I tend to agree with what Natalia said. I mean, it's clear that we don't have the right instruments because, as I said, competition is played differently in the digital world than it is in the non-digital world. Okay, so we have to retool. But I think there is a more fundamental problem, which is that the responsibility does not entirely lies with the competition authorities.
Yes.
Economists have never been able to figure out clearly the relationship between competition and innovation. That's the problem. On top of that, innovation in platforms tend to be more disruptive innovation rather than sequential innovation. So that's even more complicated. But when I was a student in the US, which was 50 years ago, I mean, one talked about the inverted U curve between competition and innovation, and nobody could figure out why it was that there was this inverted U curve. This is exactly where we are now. So competition authorities can only use the tools of economic analysis that they're given by the economists. And if the economists cannot figure out really whether competition facilitates the development of innovation or whether sometimes by promoting static competition, you lessen the incentive for innovative or for dynamic innovation, there's not much that competition authorities can do. What they do in those cases, they say, well, today is surer than tomorrow. Since I cannot predict the future, I don't know how innovation is going to develop, so I'm going to forget about innovation. I'm going to focus on the static dimension, because at least that's something that you see today. And second, I'm going to focus on prices because that's even more obvious. I mean, so prices today is going to be my focus. They do this because the economies don't provide them with the intellectual tools to do otherwise.
Well, that's if I can say a word on that, because that's an amazing advocacy for precisely the study that we do at ITIF, where we launched the Schumpeter project. I mean, Frederick and Natalia, what you just said is exactly the relationship between competition and innovation is exactly the Schumpeterian competition that we see under our eyes. And this disruption, this competition by disruption is exactly what Schumpeter wrote a century ago, a bit less, but almost a century ago. And that's precisely what we're trying to develop and deepen at ITIF with the launch of the Schumpeter project. So This today's
Right.
discussion is very interesting because it's we need this international framework at the WTO, but also domestically, and competition authorities need to rethink the relationship between competition and innovation, and the Schumpeterian competition that we see on a daily basis force us to rethink the antitrust tools. So it was a great discussion. Thank you.
Well, excellent. I just want to briefly share with you all, if I may, my screen, if I can figure out the technology. Yes, here we are. This is our GTIPA website, Global Trade and Innovation Policy Alliance, and you can find the principles and framework for antitrust for global innovation declaration that we're talking about right here. So just wanted to point that out and commend it to you all. I want to be respectful of our panelists' time, knowing, as I said earlier, that several have to move on to other speeches this morning. So why don't we wrap that up there as our final comments. I do want to thank our audience for joining us today and for their great questions. I want to thank our panelists, Aurelia, Natalia, Stefano, and Frederick, for being with us today, for your excellent remarks. I also want to point out that video of this session will be available both on the ITIF website and the GTIPA website for future viewing, and if you would like to share with others. With that, thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing these discussions with yourselves in the global policy making community. Thank you all.